Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm so excited to be here today. I don't usually think of myself as a creative, so I feel like I'm especially honored to be in this space with you today. So I love this month's theme of punk, but it's, to me that means sort of counterculture, it means anti-establishment, and I think we really need that right now. But growing up, I didn't identify with this, right? I'm the oldest daughter of Chinese immigrants, and I was told pretty young that this punk was not my lane, right? I need to keep my head down, I need to get my work done, check the boxes, right? Do the things that dutiful firstborn daughters of immigrant children do, right? And that worked fine until it didn't, right? So for folks who know, right, if you're in a tenure track position at a university, in about the 6th year, you go up for a tenure review. And this is an up or out process, right? Either you get promoted, you get tenure, and you essentially get job security pretty much for the rest of your life. We'll see, SB1 is doing some interesting things to that. Or you basically get fired, right? So I went up for tenure review in 2016. And this, incidentally, the first step in this process is for the faculty to meet in your department, okay? And they take a vote on whether they support you getting tenure or not. Okay, so this incidentally happened on my birthday that year, in 2016. And after the vote, my department chair came by my office and he gave me the news. The vote was positive. There were 3 negative votes, but you did cross the threshold of 75% positive, which is enough for you to be recommended for tenure. So I'm thrilled. Don't count your chickens before you're hatched, but this is good news, right? So I'm very thankful at this point, and I asked my chair, is there anything else I should be concerned about? Do you anticipate any other issues or challenges beyond this? And he was like, no, I don't see anything. Okay? So 2 days later, he sends me this letter, an email. I conclude that Dr. Chen's research program meets the absolute minimum expectations of AEDE with respect to research quality, is below expectations with respect to research quantity, exceeds expectations with respect to grantsmanship, and has not demonstrated a trajectory that provides for a positive assessment of the likelihood of continued productivity. Yes, that's my underlining. He thankfully did not actually underline that last bit. Yeah, right? So totally out of left field. I'm completely blindsided by this, right? And it feels like a total dead end, right? This is up or out, and basically I'm out at this point, right? And so I talked to some senior colleagues, and they tell me, you should just roll with this, right? Because the chair doesn't support you. If your chair doesn't support you, no one else is going to support you. This isn't going to be a good environment for you. You can't be successful here, right? They don't want you here, basically, right? And my chair was going to be in his role for another 5 to 6 years at least, right? You should just bow out gracefully, go along with this, right? But that last bit about potential really got me, right? It was really just needling me, right? And now, of course, there's a lot more research on this. It's something I think that many of us have known for a long time, right, as women, is that men are promoted on potential or hired on potential, and women are hired for performance, for achievements, right? So these are just snippets from a few different academic studies, right? Women are viewed as risky appointments. She was able to do the work up until now, but we're not really sure she can get to the next level or that she's ready for the next level, right? I don't know how many of you have heard that before? Yeah. Right? In this paper, which I think is really interesting, that was done by someone at MIT Business School. Some businesses, right, including Amazon, use performance review metrics that include an evaluation of your performance and your potential, right? And they find that for those, women received higher performance ratings than male employees, but received lower ratings on potential than men, right? So they performed better, but their potential was always evaluated as lower, or on average anyway, right? And so they were less likely to be promoted, despite doing just as well or better in their performance. Okay, so that part was really bothering me, and it felt very subjective to me, right? It was like, okay, so you said I basically met the somewhat objective criteria, but I didn't meet your subjective notion of what potential was or what a trajectory is supposed to look like, right? And I have a family here in Columbus. My 3 kids were finally getting into a groove. Everybody was in their schools, preschools, right? We had friends, we had a community, we had activities, all of these things, right? And again, for folks who know academia, those jobs are pretty few and far between, right? So there was nothing open locally or coming open locally that I could have moved to at that time, and I didn't want to uproot my family, right? So I decided to contest this, right, and to make my own case for why I should get promoted. Okay, so I started writing everything down, right? I'm not much of a journaler, but I am a data person, right? So this was my way of processing this, right? Is like I started going back through all the data and putting it together of like, oh, okay, who did you tenure before? What did they have compared to me? How did I do compared to them, right? All of these pieces. And it was really cathartic for me, right? Because it was also the opportunity to go back through all of those annual review letters where I'd been surprised by sort of a mediocre assessment of my performance. I was like, oh, I thought I had a pretty good year, but I guess, my department chair didn't think so. And all those times where I'm like, gee, I wonder why I'm being asked to do this extra committee work or this extra teaching thing, right? And all of those times where I had asked other people about it, right? And they had minimized it and said, don't worry about it, just go with the flow, keep your head down, do your work, right? It's not personal, right? But it was, right? Once I started putting all this data together, I'm like, it is, this has been a pattern all throughout my career, right? And everybody's been denying it. I've been denying it, right? I've been told to deny it. I've been told that it wasn't real, right? Being gaslit about all of this stuff, right? And so, yes, this is my 8-page contestation of my chair's decision. So it went up to the college level, and thankfully, I don't know if thankfully is the right word, but I'm very glad that the college committee agreed with me, as did the dean and everybody else up the chain. Thank you. So I got tenured. But as people predicted, I was basically a pariah at this point in my department, right? So people who hadn't supported me, of course, were disappointed that I hadn't left. And even people who were sort of indifferent or who had supported me, those spaces where like something bad has happened, but you're not really quite sure how to address it. And so you just sort of try to avoid the person, right? And avoid the conversation. And that's what happened, right? So sort of nobody was talking to me. Nobody was working with me. And so I figured, you know what? In for a penny, in for a pound. I'm a glutton for punishment, and I have a high pain tolerance. Right? And I knew that I had been being underpaid for about 5 years at this point, okay? Because all our salaries at OSU are public information. They're posted on a website. Right? So I was comparing myself to male colleagues. The department had just hired 2 years previously 4 new assistant professors, right? So more junior than me, less experienced than me, fewer achievements, obviously, since they were at the beginning of their careers, and they were all making more money than me, even after the promotion, right? So I was like, okay, well, this is the time where I'm going to go on for this pay equity case, right? Or a pay equity appeal. And these are just some stats on, in general, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about is the gender pay gap and also the racial pay gap, right? So you can just see this diagram of for every $1 that a white non-Hispanic man earns, what is it that other people earn, right, in different demographic groups, right? Where you get it down to Hispanic women are earning sort of less than 60 cents on the dollar, right? Still. And this is the first year actually where these gaps have gotten worse since we started measuring them in like the 70s, okay? This also I find really striking, right? So this is for a lifetime of work based on this gender pay gap. If we look at the average for all women, the estimated lost income is almost $500,000, $431,000. And these are all the things that you could do with that amount of money, right? Maybe not buy 2 houses, that seems a little outdated, but a house, a few 4-year degrees, right? A few cars, so it's a lot and it adds up. And again, it's one of these things that's sort of taboo, right? Like people don't like to talk about money, they don't like to talk about their pay. And there's also this feeling of like, it was my fault, right? Like if I'd done better, if I'd worked harder, this wouldn't be happening, right? That I had caused this somehow. So I filed this appeal and I actually ended up getting a 20% pay increase. Thank you. Which means, right, that out of the last 5 years I had been at the university, I'd essentially worked one of them for free, right? And so part of this process that was helpful for me was I learned to ask these sort of candid questions, right? So somebody in the pay equity appeal committee said, well, you've been taking a lot of flexibility with your job, and isn't that what this pay is reflecting? Is the fact that you're taking compensation in the form of flexibility, and you're right? So it's like, oh, that's an interesting thought. Can you explain more about how you think that works, right? And so really asking these questions about, well, what is the default and why, right? Is this really the best that we can do, right? Does this align with your values, right? So one of the things that came up is like, oh, and in academic roles, there's a lot of salary compression. People who stay for a long time don't see their pay go up as fast as people who are joining from the outside, right? And that happens to almost everyone. And so this is just part of the process. It very well might be, and it is. I know it happens to lots of people. You have the opportunity to correct it right now, right? And is that the right thing to do or not, right? I'm not asking you to fix the world, right? We're not boiling the ocean, but do what's right in this moment, right? And other things about why are we still doing things this way, right? Of like, this was, in this case, and in many cases, right, you have to go with the pay equity case directly to your manager, right? Which means that they have to acknowledge at some point, or else punt the ball, right, and say, somebody else was complicit in this, right? Somebody else allowed this pay equity, or somebody created this pay equity and kept it going, right? And people don't like to admit that, right? So some other things I realized, right, were that these processes that are shrouded in secrecy, right, really tend to support existing power structures, right? We don't talk about, it's very hush-hush, right? It actually has a lot of parallels to other forms of emotional abuse, right? We're like, that's personal, we don't talk about that, I don't want to be in your business, that kind of thing, right? And then people are isolated both in and by their experience, right? At this point, I was like, oh, is this just happening to me, right? Does this happen to other people? And then gradually you learn, right? Oh, no, this has actually happened a lot, right? And this is, it's not just me, right? And there's also this issue where our silence is taken as assent, right? As this tacit agreement with what has been done to us, right? Because well, why didn't you say something? Why did you stay? Why did you stay in that job? Right? Well, I had nowhere to go. What else was I supposed to do? right? So I felt like there was a lot of power in our stories and in sharing those stories, right? So I actually wrote up a whole academic paper about the gender pay gap at OSU, sent it to a journal for peer review, and this was one of the comments from one of the reviewers, right? Maybe women just don't like money as much as men. That's why we get paid less. Right? And so that was the moment where I was like, I can't be an economist anymore. If this is a thing economists say to each other, like, I cannot. Right? So the paper did actually get published. Thankfully, the editor overlooked that critique. And then when the university put out a sort of press release about the publication, this was the quote that my chair wanted included in the piece, right? So it said, although Chen's case was not based specifically on gender considerations, her experience led her to wonder how widespread pay disparities still were at the university. Right, so there was never a moment, there still has not been, when anyone has ever acknowledged that the reason I was underpaid was related to gender, right? And so everyone agrees, right, that data can tell a story, but what does it take to acknowledge stories as data, right? I'd had my story, I had a peer-reviewed paper, I had all kinds of women who were like, yes, I'm underpaid, right? And still they're like, we don't think it's a gender thing. It's just, unfortunate, or women don't like money as much, or whatever, right? So a lot of that led me to make this pivot, right? To dive more into DEI work at the university, to see how I could make change institutionally and for individuals, right? By sharing my story more broadly. And then as I moved over to women's gender and sexuality studies, I've had the opportunity to teach them new classes. There's one of my students is here, called Data Feminism, where we talk about data from a feminist perspective, right? And what does it mean to use a feminist lens, a racial justice lens, a social justice lens, to think about data and what we even consider to be data, right? Because my story, for a lot of people, is a story. It's not a data point, right? And so what does it take for it to be a data point? Right? We can think about the reverse, right? Our president tells one story about one person who is victimized by one undocumented immigrant, right? And all of a sudden that becomes the data, the narrative, the truth, right? From one story. But if I tell one story, it's just my story, right? And so where's that privilege coming from, right? And what are we counting as data? Right? So a lot of it is thinking about, or where I want to go now is thinking about in my research, what are harmful data regimes, right? And how do we think about new ways to reduce the harm that is actually committed through data analytics, right? So that's what I'm trying to do now, right, is to do better, to think about the spaces where I have privilege and where can I lean in based on that privilege to question the status quo, to say, why are we doing things like this, right? Does this make sense? And how can we change this, right? And also, what is that default, right? The default in most cases has been created for and by the previously dominant groups, right? White men, right? And it doesn't work for everyone else, right? It never was meant to, right? And so the fact that we still keep trying to fit ourselves into that without asking why it looks like that, right, is limiting, I think, some of the progress that we can achieve. Okay, so just to wrap up, a little bit of tea about OSU. So as folks have probably heard, right, all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have been, quote unquote, sunsetted. We did discuss, a small group of us, having a funeral actually for DEI instead, since sunset is such a innocuous word. So we now have guidance, a full implementation guide online about DEI prohibitions. We're figuring out, or the university is figuring out how to comply with SB1. So, we're supposed to be more mindful of the way we teach controversial beliefs and policies, make sure that we're not indoctrinating our students with any particular point of view. And even in research, right? And this I just find so stunning, right? So in our research, we're supposed to avoid discussion that seeks to influence government policy or connect research to broader political issues. Right? That's the whole point of research. Right? Like, if you think universities are useless ivory towers, this is the way to make us more, to silo us in our towers, right? So, I'm just struggling to process what we're supposed to do with this, right? And in my class, we've discussed a lot this idea that research should use a neutral tone and avoid the use of language and phrases that could lead the reader to believe content is not based on the findings of research, right? But neutral is, again, a very loaded word, right? It depends on what the status quo is, right? Neutral to me is not neutral to everyone. Okay, so we're in this moment where, I think we're having to think a lot about, as instructors, what academic freedom means, right? The university is so far saying that SB1 does not infringe on academic freedom, right? And that within the context of our courses, we can continue to teach whatever we choose to teach, as long as we're not indoctrinating anyone, right? As long as we're not presenting things with bias, and as long as we welcome all viewpoints, right? But then, of course, there are these mechanisms, right, where students now get to respond to a question that says, has the instructor created an environment free of bias in the classroom, right? Our syllabi need to be publicly accessible. And so it's just a matter of time until somebody complains, right? And says, I'm indoctrinating them, or I'm biased, or whatever, right? And the university hasn't said anything about how they're gonna step up to protect faculty and students, right? A lot of our graduate students are teaching courses too, right? In these spaces. And so we're at this kind of crossroads of like, what does it mean to, am I being complicit in this system, right? If I keep teaching and pretending like this doesn't matter, right? The SB1 isn't affecting things, right? Or is it better to do that, right? To make sure the knowledge still gets out in the way that I want it, in the way that's authentic, right? To the discipline and to the research and to the science and the study, but at that risk, right, to myself, and acknowledging again that I have a lot of privilege in this space, right? If someone comes for me, I'm tenured, I've got a lot of wiggle room here. Our graduate students don't have that, our untenured faculty don't have that, our lecturers don't have that, right? So what's incumbent upon me to take on in this space, right? What's my responsibility? Okay. So these are some of the questions I kind of want to leave you with, right? So, where is your line between making change within the system and being complicit in the system, right? And I think a lot of this is about thinking about your values before you're forced to make a decision so that you have them clear in your head, right? Of like, I'm definitely not crossing this line, right? Because otherwise you have that risk of once you get to the line, you're like, oh, maybe it's just a little, tiptoe wouldn't be so bad, right? And then thinking about, how can you challenge the status quo and make space for other perspectives, right? And then also, what if everyone else made the same choices as you, right? We have a similar kind of issue here as with voting, right? Of like individually voting sort of, according to economists, is irrational, right? Because your one vote doesn't make a difference. But if everybody made that choice, right? Or if enough people make that choice, right, then we end up with big problems, right? So a lot of thinking about that kind of collectiveness, right, of our community and how do we bring that all together. Yeah. Oh, and my final plug. If you're concerned about SB1, as I am, and in as much of the higher ed community is, please visit ohiosb1petition.com to find places to sign the petition. It's a voter referendum to turn back SB1. So, thank you.
Thank you.